I first noticed Ethan on a rainy Thursday, the kind of afternoon when the world feels paused between decisions. He was sitting 2 rows ahead of me in the quiet corner of the city library, his shoulders slightly hunched, his fingers tracing invisible patterns along the edge of a book he wasn't really reading. There was nothing extraordinary about him at first glance, just another face in a place full of strangers, but something about his stillness made me look twice that I told myself it was coincidence. I was engaged, after all. 5 years with Daniel had trained me to dismiss small curiosities as meaningless. Daniel and I shared an apartment, a routine, and a future that looked sensible on paper. We had dinner together most nights, spoke about wedding venues, and argued gently about furniture we hadn't bought yet. Our life was stable, predictable, and safe, and yet, when Ethan glanced back and our eyes met for a second too long, I felt a shift inside me that had nothing to do with safety. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing him everywhere, on the same bus route, at the same coffee shop near the station, always ordering black coffee, always sitting alone. It became a quiet ritual for me to arrive early, pretending I needed time to think, when in truth I just wanted to see if he would show up. One evening, as I reached for a napkin at the coffee counter, my hand brushed against his. He flinched, then smiled an apology. "Sorry," he said softly. "Didn't see you there." "It's okay," I replied, aware of how careful my voice sounded. That we stood there for a moment longer than necessary, suspended in an awkward politeness neither of us wanted to break. "I'm Ethan," he added. "Lucas," I said, and for some reason, saying my name felt more intimate than it should have. That should have been the end of it, a brief interaction between two strangers. But the next day, he sat at my table without asking. "Hope you don't mind," he said. "This place gets lonely." I should have minded. I should have mentioned Daniel. I should have drawn a line before there was even a shape to cross. Instead, I nodded that we talked about ordinary things at first: work, books, the city. Ethan was a freelance photographer, drifting between short-term projects, always searching for something he couldn't quite define. I told him about my job at a marketing firm, about deadlines and meetings that blurred together, about how life felt like a checklist I was trying to complete. That he listened in a way Daniel hadn't in a long time. With Daniel, conversations had become transactional. We spoke about groceries, bills, and schedules. We rarely spoke about ourselves. When I tried to explain this to myself, I called it growing up. With Ethan, it felt like remembering something I had forgotten. Days turned into weeks. Our coffee meetings became intentional. We never labeled them as such, but both of us rearranged our routines to make sure they happened. There was a gentle tension between us, unspoken but undeniable. One evening, as we walked toward the bus stop, Ethan said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I hesitated. "That depends. Are you seeing someone?" The question landed heavier than it should have. "Yes," I said. "I'm engaged." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer but hoped to be wrong. I figured. "You have that taken energy." I laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Is that a thing?" "It is when you don't talk about them," he replied. There was no accusation in his tone, just observation. Still, I felt exposed. "I love him," I said, quickly, as if convincing myself. "I really do." "I believe you," Ethan said. "Love isn't the problem most of the time." That night, I lay beside Daniel, listening to his steady breathing, wondering why Ethan's words echoed louder than my own thoughts. Daniel's hand rested on my chest, familiar and warm, but my mind replayed the way Ethan's eyes softened when he smiled, as if he were seeing something in me I had stopped noticing that I didn't tell Daniel about Ethan. I told myself there was nothing to tell, but the secrecy became part of the connection. The more I hid it, the more significant it felt. My phone buzzed with messages from Ethan, small, harmless things at first. A photo of the sunset. A line from a book. A simple "Are you okay today?" and I always replied that I knew what I was doing, even if I refused to name it. I wasn't cheating in action, but I was cheating in intention. I was emotionally present somewhere I no longer fully belonged. The realization frightened me more than the attraction itself. One evening, as Ethan and I stood under the dim streetlight outside the cafe, rain falling between us like a curtain, he said, "Sometimes I feel like I met you at the wrong time." I looked at him, my heart tightening. Maybe. Or maybe we just met before we were ready. He smiled sadly. Or before you were. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The silence said what I couldn't admit yet, that the line between friendship and something else had already disappeared, and I was standing on the wrong side of my own promises. I began measuring time in messages. At first, they were casual, Ethan sending me a photo from a rooftop he'd discovered, or a song he said reminded him of late evenings and unfinished thoughts. I replied with the same carelessness I pretended to feel, but every notification carried a quiet anticipation. My phone became a private doorway I stepped through whenever Daniel wasn't looking. Daniel noticed the change before I did. "You've been distant lately," he said one night, standing in the kitchen while I scrolled through my screen. "Work stress?" "Yeah," I replied too quickly. "Just deadlines." He accepted it, the way people do when they trust you more than they should. With Ethan, I felt awake in a way I hadn't for years. Our conversations grew longer, more personal, slipping past safe topics into memories, fears, and the things we never admitted to anyone else. "I don't think I've ever felt settled," Ethan wrote once. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means I keep waiting for my life to start." I stared at the words, unsettled by how familiar they felt. My life had already started, at least according to everyone around me. I had a partner, a plan, a future. But Ethan's restlessness mirrored something I had buried under responsibility. That we met more often now, though we avoided calling them dates. Coffee turned into long walks. Walks turned into dinners that lasted until the restaurants closed around us. We never touched beyond brief hugs, never crossed any visible boundary, but everything about us existed in the space between restraint and desire. One evening, while we sat on a bench overlooking the river, Ethan said, "Do you ever wonder who you'd be if you'd made different choices?" I knew what he was really asking. All the time, I admitted. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever wonder about us?" The air felt heavier after that. I could hear my own heartbeat, too loud, too fast. "I try not to," I said. "But you do," he replied gently. I didn't deny it. Denial required more energy than honesty. That night, I went home to Daniel and felt like I was carrying a second life inside me. He told me about his day, about a promotion he was hoping for, about a vacation he wanted us to plan. I listened, nodded, smiled when expected, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan's question. "Do you ever wonder about us?" The worst part wasn't that I wondered. It was that the wondering felt necessary. I began deleting messages, not because Daniel checked my phone, but because I couldn't bear the possibility that he might. The secrecy became routine. I justified it by telling myself I was protecting everyone, Daniel from hurt, Ethan from rejection, myself from impossible choices. In truth, I was protecting the illusion. Ethan sensed the shift. "You're holding back," he said one evening when we met at the same cafe where we'd first spoken. "I feel it." "I'm just trying to be careful," I replied. "Careful about what? Or about who?" I looked away. "About hurting people." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're already hurting yourself." The honesty in his words unsettled me. Ethan didn't demand anything from me. He didn't ask me to leave Daniel, didn't pressure me to define what we were. Instead, he offered presence, attention without conditions. And somehow, that made it harder to resist. One night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the living room and typed a message I'd never intended to send. "Sometimes I think I met you too late." The three dots appeared almost instantly. "Or maybe we just met before you were honest with yourself." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Ethan had a way of saying what I avoided, not with accusation, but with clarity. What would honesty even look like? I asked. There was a pause this time. "It would look like you admitting that you're here with me, even if your body isn't." I closed my eyes. He was right. I was emotionally present in a space I pretended didn't exist. Daniel and I shared a home, but Ethan and I shared something quieter and more dangerous, emotional intimacy without permission. The next time we met, the tension between us felt different, no longer subtle, no longer ambiguous. It was as if the truth had finally been spoken, and neither of us could pretend it hadn't changed anything that we stood across from each other on the empty street, the city lights blurring behind him. "I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart," Ethan said. "You're not," I replied. "You're just the reason I'm questioning it." He smiled faintly, but his eyes were serious. "That's what scares me." I took a step closer, stopping just short of touching him. The space between us felt deliberate, fragile, and charged with everything we weren't saying. "What if we had chosen each other back then?" Ethan asked quietly. "Do you think we'd still be standing here like this?" The question lingered in the air, unresolved, impossible to answer. And for the first time, I understood that the past wasn't just something we remembered, it was something that had returned to demand a decision I could no longer avoid. I didn't answer Ethan's question that night. I couldn't. Some questions feel less like invitations and more like mirrors, and I wasn't ready to see what I might discover in my own reflection. Instead, I went home and sat beside Daniel on the couch, watching a show neither of us was paying attention to. He laughed at a joke, leaning his head against my shoulder, and I felt the familiar comfort of his presence. This was the life I had built, steady, reliable, and shaped by years of shared decisions. Yet even as his hand rested in mine, I felt the weight of another reality pressing against it, that I was living in two emotional spaces, and they were finally colliding. The next day, I asked Ethan to meet me. Not at the cafe, not on a casual walk, but somewhere neutral, somewhere that felt less like habit and more like intention. We met in a quiet park just outside the city, where the noise faded into distant traffic and the trees formed a kind of accidental privacy. Ethan arrived first. He looked nervous, pacing slightly, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. "You sounded serious," he said. "I am," I replied. That we stood facing each other, close enough to feel the tension, far enough to avoid touching it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy with everything we'd postponed. "I can't keep doing this," I said finally. "I can't pretend we're just friends when we both know we're not." Ethan nodded slowly. "So what are we, then?" The honesty in his voice undid me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I know what I feel. And I know what I'm risking." "What do you feel?" he asked. That I inhaled, steadying myself. "I feel like I'm standing in front of someone who knows parts of me I've hidden even from myself. And I feel like that scares me more than it should." Ethan's expression softened. "I feel it too. But I don't want to be your secret." That word, secret, landed painfully. Because that was exactly what he had become. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but quietly, through my avoidance and fear. That we stood there, the distance between us shrinking without either of us moving. For a moment, I thought I might lean in. I thought I might finally cross the line I'd been tracing for weeks. The urge felt natural, almost inevitable, like gravity, but then Daniel's face appeared in my mind, not as an obstacle, not as a villain, but as a person who trusted me. That I stepped back. Ethan noticed. His jaw tightened, though he didn't look angry. He looked disappointed in a way that felt far worse. "I can't do this," I said, my voice low. "Not like this. Not while I'm still pretending to be fully present somewhere else." "So what happens now?" he asked. That I hesitated. I think I need to be honest. With Daniel. And with myself." Ethan studied me for a long moment. "And where does that leave me?" The question hurt more than any accusation could have. "I don't know," I said. "But I know it's not fair to keep you in this space where you're waiting for something I haven't chosen." He exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for weeks. "You know what the hardest part is?" "What?" "You're not choosing between me and him. You're choosing between who you've been and who you might become." I realized then how much I had projected onto Ethan. He wasn't just a person, I had turned him into a symbol of possibility, of an alternate life where I hadn't settled so early, where I hadn't learned to confuse stability with fulfillment. But symbols don't make good foundations for real relationships. That night, I told Daniel everything, not every detail, not every thought, but enough to tell the truth. Enough to admit that I had grown emotionally distant, that I had formed a connection with someone else, that I had crossed a line even without physical betrayal. He listened in silence. When I finished, he didn't shout. He didn't accuse me. He just looked tired. "I wish you had talked to me before it became this," he said. "So do I," I replied. That we didn't break up that night. We didn't resolve anything either. We simply acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted, and that pretending otherwise would only delay the damage. That I didn't see Ethan again after that. That we exchanged a few messages, careful, restrained, honest in a way we hadn't been before. Eventually, the conversations slowed, then stopped altogether. Not because the feelings disappeared, but because we both understood that holding on would only prolong something that couldn't exist without hurting someone else. Sometimes I still think about him. About the version of myself I was with him, about the life I briefly imagined and then let go, but I also think about what I learned, that love isn't just about who makes your heart race. It's about who you choose to be honest with, even when honesty costs you something, and that some people don't come into your life to stay, they come to remind you that you are still capable of wanting more, and that wanting more means nothing if you're not brave enough to face the consequences of it.